Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode in our History of Revolutionary Ideas is a different kind of conversation about a different kind of revolution than the ones we've talked about so far. I'm going to be speaking to the economic historian Alexis Litvine about the Industrial Revolution. It's at least 250 years old, and it's still going strong. This is a revolution that we are still living through. And this conversation stretches over quite a long period of time. It goes back before the 18th century, and it brings the story up to today. What has thinking about the Industrial Revolution done to the ways in which human beings understand their world, then and now? Revolutionary thinking over 2.5 centuries and more. We're talking today about a revolution that's clearly very different from most of the revolutions and revolutionary ideas that we are covering in this series, in the sense that the Industrial Revolution is not a political event. It's not straightforwardly an event in the world of ideas, in that I imagine quite a lot of people think that the Industrial Revolution is something that happened in the world of things and the ways in which things are made or manufactured. And it may seem like it's a stretch from that to a revolutionary idea. But I found myself thinking about the revolution that we have been living through, which is the digital revolution, which sometimes gets called the fourth industrial revolution. Doesn't matter what we call it, but it is usually called a revolution. And I think most people, you and I, Alexis, have lived through it. People listening to this podcast have lived through it. Most people are comfortable with the thought it's a revolution. That doesn't get a lot of pushback. But I think most people would also recognize straight away that the digital revolution is itself an idea. In some ways, it's almost an ideology. It conveys a way of thinking about the world. It's an idea with a provenance. It comes from a set of ideas that were located for a while in a particular place, Silicon Valley in California. It has changed the way that ideas are produced and consumed, including podcasts. And it has changed the way people think. It's certainly changed the way that I think. It's changed human beings' relationship to the world. So a change in the world of things and how they are made has changed the way that human beings think. And it is changes in the way that human beings think that allowed for the changes in the world of things and how they are made. So that's a long way of me starting by saying, if we take that for granted, it's not such a stretch to call the Industrial Revolution a revolution in the world of ideas. The one that we're going to be talking about, the first Industrial Revolution, so second half of the 18th century, when it begins is not exactly agreed, or the last third of the 18th century, and then on from there, pretty much through to now. What would you say, this is a big question to start with, but what would you say was the biggest change that the Industrial Revolution made to the way that human beings thought about their world?
That's an interesting question in the sense that, for the reason you've just listed, people didn't realize there was an industrial revolution until much later after the event. So in a sense, this idea that they conceptualize or they started to think about their experience as part of an industrial revolution is something very retrospective. But that doesn't mean that people didn't at the time experience radical changes. And the fact that we today can conceptualize, let's say, the digital transformations that we're living now as a revolution becomes of this kind of intellectual template that is born out of the Industrial Revolution, but obviously people didn't have at the time. So it's an interesting thing. But the popular experience obviously is something that we can study and we can analyze, but we can't analyze it as the subsequent elements, which were obviously analyzed in the light of these first one. We are a bit used to sometimes, especially when we move in the world of ideas, in disembodying these ideas. And so the Industrial Revolution is not a thing that is experienced universally. It is very much something that is located in time and in space. There's an element in which that experience is very fragmented. There's not a moment in which suddenly humans, even Europeans, or even certainly Britons, change their way of thinking, of feeling, of experimenting things.
So I'm actually interested in the fragmented bit. So there's a transformative moment in the 19th century, but the origins of the transformation are in the 18th. People will date it differently, partly depending on which they think is the sort of definitive early invention, the early transformation in the world of manufacturing rather than in the world of ideas. But in the fragmented part of this story, when do you want to say that it starts?
It's a very difficult question to answer because it is a very debated topic. And for a very simple reason is that it is an object that requires defining what we study. Often, as historians, when you decide on periodization, you decide the nature of the object you study. So if I say this starts in the late 18th century in the West Riding of Yorkshire, or if it starts with a specific invention, say Thomas Newcomen, a steam engine, I am actually defining this revolution in a specific way. And this is not necessarily the most correct way. I would be probably disappointed that my personal view is that it starts somewhere in the late 16th century. So my view of the Industrial Revolution is a much more encompassing thing, which we're restoring something that had been erased by a certain kind of scholarship. And we can talk about the reasons for that transformation into an event if you want later, because these are political and cultural. But we can now restore this very long progressive evolution in terms of the history of techniques, in terms of inventions, but also in terms of the building up of new capabilities and education and human knowledge, which led really to this progressive transformation in the late 18th century. But there's no doubt that in the late 18th century, there's a wave of sustained invention that we call the classical period of the Industrial Revolution, which is particularly meaningful.
The changes in experiment, material, manufacture, productivity, thinking about energy, thinking about nature, they start to coalesce and interact with each other in a way that feels like a step change. And I'm trying to sort of capture in the world of ideas how that step change itself was understood. It is comparable to the digital revolution. We are living through it. So in 50 years' time, people will have a different view of what it is that we've lived through. But we have lived through a set of transformations that we're trying to make sense of. Do you have a sense of how people, let's say in England, because this is where it started, in England, in the second half of the 18th century, experienced this? Are you saying they didn't experience it as a revolution?
As a revolution, probably not, but that they didn't experience it, definitely not. Think about the east of England. In East Anglia, for example, most women would have been hand spinners, or would have been a large number of women would have been spinning yarn, and this would have been a significant share of their household income. So this was one of the great wealth of East Anglia. If you see, since medieval times, the great cathedral in now towns that seem so small, it's not because there was some riches that were lost. It's because mostly the woolen trades and then the textile trade was really fundamentally bringing enormous amount of money. Well, with the mechanization of spinning, all these women lost their income. So you have perhaps one of the most radical shock in terms of employment in the 18th century. So saying that those women didn't experience it would be obviously a complete fallacy because they created a real significant hardship in the east of England, but also completely transformed the economic geography of this country. The idea that the development in the north and the agrarian southeast was the norm didn't make sense before then. But so there's a massive transformation of the economic structure of the country that went with this mechanization. So definitely this is experience. But I don't think people then saw this as part of a broader transformation of the world of goods. This came much later on.
So why did it happen in England first? Because there's a huge argument about this among historians, economic historians, social scientists, the origins of the Industrial Revolution, never mind the time, but the place. And some people still want to relate it to material conditions. It's because in England there was coal. Some people want to relate it to politics. In England there was a set of institutional arrangements, England and Scotland, a kind of parliamentary system that created confidence in the rule of law, confidence in investment. Some people want to relate it to empire. But there are also arguments that say it comes out of a world of ideas as well. There was a world of ideas that was particularly fertile for this kind of change in England in the 18th century. Enlightenment is one word for it. Do you buy that?
There's no doubt that England, by the early 18th century, is in a completely different position to every other nation in the world. Britain is in a unique place at the time. No other country in the world has There's such a small number of people working in agriculture. So, if you want, one of the greatest discoveries in this history was that before the age of the Industrial Revolution, before this classical period, Britain had already had a structural change. So, most people working in the secondary sector, that is in industry, that happened before the Industrial Revolution. So, this is a puzzle. Britain had already achieved this massive structural change without the age of the machine. So something already is putting Britain in a different position. But then the natural endowments or the presence of coal is obviously significant. You had other nations that already underwent a similar structural change. And obviously, the Netherlands and the Low Countries is one of the significant element here. But the Low Countries didn't have coal. They had peat, or there are discussions about how much one could be substituted for the other. But certainly, there is a different in terms of natural endowment. And the best way to think about this is if you want to change a social model or a model in which a society organizes itself, both its economy and society, it's not generally a small, simple thing which matters. Even if you try to decree it, it will not work. But how do you make it sustainable? And what really happened in Britain this time is a sustainable transformation, sustainable perhaps not in the environmental way, but sustainable in the sense that it didn't stop after a short while. The sustainable transformation, the relationship between the way in which invention, these new forms of energy, and the world of production could work together. And yes, for that, the world of ideas is not insignificant. If you think about the, say, two geopolitical giants in Western Europe at the time, let's say in the 18th century, France and Britain, France was in no way backward in the world of ideas. I mean, the French savants were really savant, they really knew a lot, and lots of the key inventions that we say to them were actually French. So it's not a question that the kind of elite level something was missing in France. But one of the key theories now is this secondary level of the Enlightenment, this low level Enlightenment. Not only the people in the academies or in the Royal Savant Society, but the second tier of them, their provincial correspondence. The fact that workers would be able to suddenly engage or even read some technical literature, that kind of low level technical literacy. Well, high level in terms of the technicality, but means not on the elite. This world of the tweakers, this world of people who can, a clockmaker, suddenly try to adapt a cog and a wheel in order to make it work better, is really what distinguishes Britain from others. And this is really where perhaps some of the research is really interesting, is that if you increase the amount of the literacy or the numeracy of society, then you enable a much broader group of people to engage in the kind of technological pursuit that are interesting and may produce. And if you compare it again to your digital revolution, having a top engineer in one university being able to develop something is certainly very good. But having an army of kids who can all code and try to do this in their living room will certainly increase the likelihood of this becoming an economically viable industry. So perhaps this is the kind of comparison you could have.
And is part of the reason for that, and that it therefore, as you said, it accelerates exponentially. It acquires a life of its own, this rate of change. Is it partly because as the ability to experiment becomes distributed, and also experimenting includes tweaking and people doing what might be seen by the elites as fairly low level adjustments to these technologies, the barriers in the way of change feeding off change fall away. So in an earlier age, and maybe even in France in the 18th century, there are institutional barriers in the way of these changes spreading, percolating through and across society, so that a transformation here can be picked up over there, and being picked up over there, someone can try and improve it, and that news passes back to where it came from. The barriers of elite entry, the barriers of education, some of this starts to fall away. I don't want to say it's democratized, because this isn't really a democratic age, but even moving from the top tier to one tier down, what you see is a genuine transformation in the ways in which ideas of the new things, new techniques, new ways of doing things spread horizontally.
The first railway journey, I can't remember exactly, I think it's 2.5 miles per hour. You would walk faster. So the idea that this is a significant in terms of transformation for the economy is ludicrous. The same thing for the steam engine. What matters is not the invention of the steam engine, which is fundamentally useless unless you are pumping water out of a coal mine where you can burn as much fuel as you want. And that would be better than using an animal, a human. It's the progressive improvement in the efficiency of the technology. And those small progressive iterations, which allow the technology to become economically viable or transformative, is really that kind of story that we see in the Industrial Revolution. It is a fundamental transformation in the way in which humans relate to each other and to their environment. There is nothing like this in the history of humanity. There's a before and there's an after.
So there's a before and there's an after, and we could maybe date the after, that is awareness of it, enough evidence of it in real time for the people living through it to make it hard to argue with. And that only comes in the 19th century, and then it only gets its name later on. And it maybe requires people coming from the outside, people coming to Britain from Europe to point out just how dramatic the change is. So there's a before and there's an after, and the second half of the 18th century is a kind of early during where some of this is going on, but it's hard to perceive it. It's happening in small places. But if the key element is the thing that you described, which is not the big inventions that we associate with it, it's the micro improvement, it's the climate of micro improvement. Why didn't that happen sooner? I mean, what is it about the period that we call the Industrial Revolution where that becomes the driver of innovation and ultimately, not straight away, ultimately, of economic growth? Do we explain that because a social shift has happened? Do we explain that because there's some precondition to those conditions being right? And that happened in England sooner than it happened in other places. Because if you really hone in on that, it becomes then again a little mysterious. What is it about the second half of the 18th century and then into the first part of the 19th century that that form of innovation, micro innovation distributed across that second tier down, becomes the engine of change?
There are structural elements, for example, of which Britain is part, but is not necessarily the only player. So the alignment of the Republic of Letters or the kind of networks of scholarship and the diffusion of useful knowledge across Europe are a reality, and Britain is part of them. But you're right, that's really kind of the upper crust of this enlightenment. If we look at the population of Britain in 1700, only 50% of the population is engaged in agriculture. This is revolutionary in itself at the time.
What are the other 50% doing? Because they're not working in factories.
Well, they're working in industry, or an industry could be blacksmith or a shoemaker, or this is obviously not the world of large factories, but some of them are working in workshops, in metal industries, and lots of them are working in transport. So the more goods you produce, the more you need to move. So people are moving them around and retailing them. So there's all this service economy, and actually service is really the big driver economic growth already by then.
And did they call it industry then? I mean, we're going to call it the Industrial Revolution as though something happens which gets the name industrial. But if in 1700 half the population were working broadly, I mean, it's artisanal, but we can call it industry. What did people think of the word industry? What did they think this thing was? Was it something new, or was it what human beings have always done, just on a bigger scale? There have always been blacksmiths, there have always been workshops, there have always been artisans.
So the word industry itself and the perception of this change, yes, by then it was recognized as something positive. I think the key articulation there came a couple of generations earlier at the end of sort of the civil wars, when there's something really that is dramatic that is happening, where the idea of industry and desiring more accumulation of goods and money stopped being seen as something sinful, but became a positive social force. There's a cultural revolution here in terms of the way industry is perceived. But if we go back just to your point before, so people are working in industry. If you think about this, if you're engaged in agriculture, if you're plowing the field from morning to night, and working in the fields is an extremely hard work. If you're on your knees harvesting turnips from the early years as a child, it's unlikely you'll have lots of time to experiment with machines. Obviously, if you are engaged in the production of textile or you're producing clocks and you realize that you can help perhaps your wife in improving the way in which she spins yarn or whatever, you are more likely to do it. So, I mean, in a basic level, there's clearly already something different by helping people who are engaged in those kind of activities put their brain to improving the task of what they're doing. The second also is precisely because we're not living in the world of the factory, people also, if you want to use Marx's language, they own the means of production. So an improvement made in a way is a positive thing in itself. So you could imagine how a large artisanal class or a large artisanal group of people may produce that interest and knowledge in the mechanical world. So I'm sure that's one element of your answer. But then the other one is, why is it happening here and not sooner? That's related to that macroeconomic shift, but also to some chance. The institutional climate you were describing is significant. So, for example, in France, if you're moving goods around, you have internal trade barriers. That certainly is not conducive to more trade. So, the way in which trade barriers exist or do not exist in the country is one thing. The role, obviously, with the colonies and trade routes in supply is obviously another one of those structural elements. And then warfare on the continent is also another element. So all these elements can contribute to explain why Britain was in a particular place at a particular time to enjoy those benefits. And the reason why that ecosystem was suddenly successful take a bit from everything. But the key thing here we cannot avoid is the presence of coal. Because someone went to a coal mine owner and said, look, it costs you a lot of money to pump your water out. I've got this thing, it's a bit crazy, but I can burn some of your coal and be easier to pump the water out. He says, yeah, okay, try it on. And the creation of an ecosystem where, based on the steam engine, obviously takes some time, but is fundamentally related to also the accessible coal deposit in Britain.
Can I ask you about war? Because as you said there, one difference, I mean, Britain is fighting wars in the 18th century, but one difference between the continent of Europe and Britain is the experience of warfare in Europe and the way in which it impinges on people's everyday lives. But there is a view in a broader historical sweep that war is the engine of innovation. And you still hear it today, actually. The thought that you hear it in relation to AI, right? There is a literal AI arms race in the sense there's a new Cold War going on. That the investment of the United States government in many of the technologies that turned into the digital revolution was itself driven by the Cold War, the existential threat that it posed, and the desire to innovate, to try new things. And it does feel like the Industrial Revolution, the early Industrial Revolution, marks a shift in that narrative in the sense that this is clearly not, in the way that you've just described it, something in which war is the driver of innovation. I'm not saying peace is the driver of innovation because Britain is a war-fighting nation and it's got its empire, which it's defending, and a lot of the money, public money, is being spent on warfare. But it's not, I think, in the story that you've just described, the innovations coming out of the military-industrial complex, whatever that meant in the 18th century, that was driving this innovation. There was something going on under social conditions which were a little bit protected from that. Or is that too simplistic? But if that is true, that is a really significant shift from the ways in which I think innovation might have been understood beforehand.
So again, if we go back to that kind of longer understanding of economic transformations, you cannot obviously then rule out the effect of war. I mean, saltpeter and cannon powder, gun making, all of these are structural industries in the way in which the slow build-up that lead to that pre-industrial industrialization of Britain. But there's also another element, is the geopolitics of the 18th century. And there's certainly a moment in which Britain finds itself cut out from European markets, and mostly because of the Napoleonic blockade. And that, in fact, put the British entrepreneurs, if you want, in a particularly favorable position. Then there are some spillovers from war, for example, in shipping or in the Navy, copper sheathing. So the fact of putting copper on the hulls of ship increases the productivity of the industry. Britain benefits also from the symbiotic relationship between the commercial fleet and the Navy. In time of peace, there is a large manpower that can be highly skilled and used for trading advantageously with its own empire and other European nations. And there are all sorts of elements which do show some spillover, but it'd be difficult to write a history of the distribution arguing it's only caused by war.
In the before and after story, one of the features of after, whenever you date it, is that the thing that we call the Industrial Revolution appears unstoppable. And it's recognized by people as seeming unstoppable. Something has been unleashed. Something has been unleashed in the ways in which human beings extract energy from nature and then use that energy to make more stuff. And the more stuff they make, the better they get at making stuff. And this thing appears to have inevitability written into it. And we still argue about this now. People talk about technological determinism, the idea that there's nothing you can do about the digital revolution. People who want to stand in the way of it are called Luddites, a term from much earlier. They're standing in the way of the tide, and the tide is coming in whatever they want to do or say. But in the earlier period, it wouldn't have been seen as inevitable. And as you say, it was enormously disruptive. So if you were in one of those pockets of society where these changes were completely upending the ways in which people had traditionally lived, made a living, subsisted off the land, organized their lives, arranged family life, and so on. And this change arrives, and it is transformative, but it's not part of a wider narrative which basically tells you to suck it up because that's the way the world is going. And we've heard so many variants of that narrative through to globalization, industrialization, post-industrialization, digitization, modernization. All of these things are presented as inevitable. But from what you say, that wouldn't have been the experience in the second half of the 18th century. So to live through that time, was it, do you think, also to think that this could be stopped, could be reversed? So the Luddite movement comes a bit later, and we can talk about that in a second. But through that first phase, the classic first industrial revolution, to what extent did human beings still believe this was under human control if they didn't like it to go back?
The Luddite movement, you say, comes later. I think it probably is embedded in it from the start. I mean, and technological innovation is not a hallmark of the 18th century. It existed before, it was just more episodic. And what really is happening is the rate of change, as you're saying. So there too, I think here we need to see it at different levels. You have a political philosophy of the machine that emerges quite early on. And some people are creating, if you want, a philosophy of the factory or philosophy of the world of production, which certainly would tell people to suck it up. And this is an inevitable element. This is something obviously that would not be recognized or understood by the workers. And for the workers, the resistance is very central, but remains central even when they're told to suck it up. And I think this is because sometimes we tend to see this simplistically as either you accept it or you don't. And in fact, most of the history of the Industrial Revolution, and this is why these people are tweakers, is that resistance is also sometimes improvement. The history of technology is the history of technologies that are transformed by the way in which people use them.
And also dislike them.
Exactly, or destroy them and just do not adopt them. But it's often interesting to think about this as we want to see this revolution as the story of the great machines that are the totemic success, but there are as many failures. Look at one of the most funny things you could do is look at the catalogs of patents. This is from crackpot things to, something that looks very reasonable and interesting. Just it was not the way that it went for whatever reason. But often the workers and the story of rejection is part of it in the way in which it was built and constructed as a technology. If you think about the technologies we have lived through in our generation, the way in which people devised the first mobile phones or, Apple released its iPhone were meant to do one thing, but people adopted it and used it in ways that were certainly unexpected, which obviously afterwards those companies caught up and, marketed in this way. But the consumers, and here in that case, we're more concerned with the consumers than the workers, but as a part to play in the social construction of technology. And this is true in the Industrial Revolution too. So there's an element where it's not just a sort of a top-down imposition, and that's the early period especially.
Is it possible to put a time frame on when this becomes something for which consumption and the role of the consumer is also one of, if not the key drivers of change? So when we talk about that early point where someone can go to someone who owns a coal pit or a coal mine and says, look, I've got a means by which you can extract this cheaper and quicker, you're going to have to invest. It's not a magic bullet. You're going to have to build something. But if you build this thing and invest some of your capital and your coal in this mechanism, you will in the end be better off. That's a productive story. But consumption is the other side of this. And when it was the needs, the demands, the expectations of consumers that created the momentum for tweaking, innovation, and so on, is it possible to talk about when and how that started? Is that much later in the story, or does it always go along hand in hand? In the way that you said, some of the tweaking might be someone who wants to tweak this technology because someone in their own family would benefit from the thing that is being made. That's almost a shift from production to consumption, just without anyone purchasing the thing that's been made. Is it a false dichotomy, production and consumption?
First, I think no one would doubt that the demand and supply sides of the equation existed from the start. I don't think you can really write a story that is only strictly one or the other. I mean, the world of the Industrial Revolution, yes, is the world of the factory, but it's the world of the goods produced in those factories. So it's the world of certainly white shirts or linen and much cheaper, of more durable goods, of exchanging your pewter for nicer porcelain. The world and the goods that are available in households, and obviously the distribution of those goods, but certainly most people start to enjoy the benefits of this. And so demand and the desire for those goods definitely play a role in there. Whether it is a driving role and early on as a contested thing, I don't think it is true. I don't think it is the demand is enough for a simple reason that the vast majority of people could not afford it at the start. They can afford it once it's cheaper. And the once it's cheaper means those things have already happened. So I think it certainly goes hand in hand. But the demand by the elite is very important. That's one of the intellectual justification for the demoralization of consumption. Is like, yes, those elites are doing some horrible things. They're buying all those billionaires. They're doing this crazy things. They're spending billions in AI. It's crazy, but it's good for society. I mean, I'm not saying that's true, but I think this is the equivalent of the argument that someone like Mandeville would have had when he was talking about precisely the relationship between sin and consumption. So this goes hand in hand without any doubt.
So Mandeville, we're talking the early 18th century. So those arguments about what drives what predate the classic beginning of the phase where this acquires a life of its own. In the second half of the 18th century, one of the things that I think we're told about the Industrial Revolution, it may be far too simplistic, but it produced a reaction because it produced a reaction in the way that people came to think about and to appreciate nature, that there emerged a kind of dichotomy or a tension between industrialization and the extraction of value in a mechanical way from the natural world. And those people who wanted to celebrate or valorize the natural world, and one word for those people that got applied to them was romantics. The romanticism was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. In the world of ideas, the revolution produced a kind of counter-revolution. And yet, I think that story is almost certainly too simplistic, not least because one of the things that the Industrial Revolution did in the world of ideas was to valorize nature. Nature and its extraordinary productive capacity becomes the story, doesn't it, in the Industrial Revolution? Isn't that one of the things that changes? Nature goes from being this fact of life, this thing in which we all live, the air that we breathe, the natural world. It's sort of there, it shapes who we are, it conditions the human condition, to this thing that has buried in it all of this extraordinary power and potential and energy for human beings. And the energy that's buried in nature, the explosive power of nature, the fact that you look at mountains and you are awestruck, that's not the opposite of the mindset of the Industrial Revolution, is it? Is that dichotomy too crude as well, do you think?
Yes, it is too crude. But you're right. I mean, first, that kind of reaction to, say, change or especially technological change has often been linked to the Romantics. And in this way, these are a group of people who have a disproportionate share of the, let's say, printed space at the time. So if you think about someone like Wordsworth Ruskin, these are people who would see them as a key voice in that line. But how representative are they of popular perception of those technologies, those changes? Very likely to be very unrepresentative. So in a way, there's a disproportionate reaction because these people are able to voice their reaction. If you think about going back to your previous point about demand, the popular demand for those goods and train travel is astounding. So clearly the sort of the numbers, and the same thing with AI, people can claim that they're not happy with AI. The number of people who subscribe to services or you want to use it is enormous. So there's an element in which here suddenly there's a contradiction between a small minority that wants to voice specific concerns and the popular action. Then about nature, what is sure is that there's definitely a cultural emergence of some of the key ideas we have about nature that are concomitant. The discovery of the sea, rather than being this disgusting, repulsive place, as being a place of leisure and enjoyment and perhaps even good for your health, rather than some kind of miasma, is also something that happens more or less at the same time. And not unsurprisingly, the time also where it becomes possible to make large number of people travel to the seaside with the railways or something. So I'm not sure to what extent they are related, but there's certainly changes here in the way in which people engage with the idea of nature. Another point about nature is perhaps the way we conceive nature. I mean, our conception of nature is obviously very much informed by the impending disaster of climate change and what we are noticing in terms of the current effect of the world of production on our planet. And there is no doubt that historians, but even people, are now looking at those technologies, say AI or others, also in terms of their environmental impact. And this is something that really clearly has its roots in the story we're looking at. And if we want to go back to your origin point of the early 18th century, there is here something dramatic that is shifting, is that most human societies were really entangled in a tension between the size of these societies, basically the number of people and the resources available. And those resources were thought as finite for a very good reason. You can grow, the share of land you're cultivating, but at some point, a rocky patch will not produce a large crop. And if you continue growing your population, at some point, these people will need to be fed. So, yes, you can expand, import colonial goods, force other peoples to give you their land or their goods. Yes, they can do that. But if you think about an economy, a sort of more close economy, this is not sustainable. And in the 18th century, precisely at this moment, something is happening in England where this link, which was perhaps the iron law of humanity since the Neolithic Revolution, since the start of agriculture, is broken. And that is changing fundamentally the role of nature, indirectly perhaps, is because nature is not only an impending cause of disaster, famine, but something that now can be liberated from and then enjoyed in different ways, especially because you can extract mineral resources which allow you to produce goods. So there's clearly a shift here that happens both in terms of economy, demography, and the perception of the natural environment. And I think that's quite significant.
As you say, it is perhaps the biggest change of them all, the escape, as it came to be known from the Malthusian trap. The escape, it turned out, had already begun at the point that it got its name. So the trap had been sprung in some ways. Something, as you say, happened in the second half of the 18th century. I think one's expectation would be that such a fundamental shift in the prospects of human mortality would change the way that human beings thought about the human condition. It would change our understanding of ourselves. I mean, it's going to change human behaviors, it's going to change reproductive behaviors, it's going to change social behavior and social expectation. If more of your children are going to live, that's a different world. But that it would change in some ways what it means to be human. And yet I suspect that's not true. I mean, I don't know, but to live through, so if that is the greatest revolution of them all, in a way, the mortality revolution, the fact that to be born is not, for most people, to face the prospect of early death. The world that we live in now, our expectation that our children will survive, our expectation that you can plan plausibly for a future. You can think about inheritance, not just in terms of legal security and reliability or political security and reliability, but physical reliability. The people will be around. And one of the questions that we have to face as a society is, are we going to go through a period where we have to transition back to far greater insecurity and expectation that the future in 20, 30 years' time is going to be extremely precarious? But if we do shift back to that, it will be after a sort of 250-year period where we have escaped from it. It's a long way of saying, do you think it changed how people thought about what it meant to be human?
One thing that changes is the change in the temporal horizon, or let's say the temporality of what it is to be human. Nowadays, you would think that in 20, 30 years, technology will be different to what it is now. And generally, you would think it would be better. You don't think there would be a technological evolution. I mean, some people aspire to it, but this is the general view is this. So this idea of progress, of at least in terms of material progress, I'm not talking here in terms of judgment on its quality, but we do have this expectation. And certainly what is happening, with the Industrial Revolution is this kind of shift in the temporality of what it is to be human. Obviously, again, it is not the same for everyone at the same time, etc. But all these caveats accepted, there certainly is a long transformation in the mental structure of humans. And that has also implication for lots of the social and economic problem that we face, where we expect technological solution to some of them. And we have been pretty successful at sorting them out in that respect. So I think there is deeply here a shift. What it means at the level of the individual itself, it's sort of a trope that if you're speaking to a peasant in France in the early 18th century, the idea that whether this children would have a better life than he or she had and would experience radically different social conditions is just something that doesn't make much sense. I think we live in a world where this question is meaningful. Whether we answer positive or negative actually determines quite a lot about our view of democracy and how we experience the institutions. So, how we answer this question has become so determinant for our societies. But that question wasn't even thinkable, perhaps, in the past. So, I think here there is something which has changed. But also, it has changed the role we have with others and with the state. By the state, I mean institutions in general. Another exceptional feature of Britain is the very early proto welfare state. The idea that in Britain there were poor laws, there was a safety net. If you migrate into a town and you fall into hardship, you're not dying. So, this is something which is already changing the horizon of expectation of individuals, but also their perception of having an institutional backup. And I think this period in history is really one where this becomes normal. And I believe that we're still in there. Whether society believes there is a safety net, an institutional safety net, and they believe in it is probably one of the core issues, political and social, of our times. And I think in that respect, we're still again in that world.
On that question of people's expectation that in 20 or 30 years' time, the technology will be better, and actually, probably people expect it to be better in 5 to 10 years' time. And that can produce a kind of fatalism, a sort of feeling like, well, the technology will take care of it as though it doesn't have much to do with us. And my favorite version of that story comes from Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So we're talking about a book, experiences from the 1830s in America, a book published in 1840, where he's on a steamboat and it sinks and he nearly drowns, and he gets off and he complains to the people who own and run the steamboat that this thing is not fit for purpose and it's a death trap. And they say, yeah, but this is America. This stuff gets better all the time. So it wasn't worth our while improving it because there'll be a better, newer model along next year or the year after. And you can tell that Tocqueville is thinking one of the problems with this mindset is the assumption that the technology will get better produces a kind of passivity among certain people who just assume that someone else will take care of it. This is his complaint about these people. Like, you mend your damn steamboat. You can't just assume that someone's got to do the innovation if it's not you. And the description you gave of the late 18th century version, and again, I have no idea, this might be a kind of ridiculous post hoc generalization, but it sounded like a world in which there wasn't that expectation. So when this thing got going early on, the tweakers, the adjusters, the micro inventors, the micro innovators were not thinking, if we don't do it, someone else will. In the way that in the 21st century, the 20th century, it turns out the 19th century, this thing had got enough momentum that it was at least possible for human beings to think, it has a life of its own. It will take care of future problems because this thing, it is called innovation or technology. It's a force in its own right. Whereas that second half of the 18th century version in Britain sounds a bit more like what got it off the ground was it came out of a world in which there wasn't that belief. At some point it'll flip. But certainly early on, to get going, the precondition of a world in which people believe in technological progress is a world in which they don't, and they think they have to do it for themselves. And so you get micro innovation.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that those tweakers were not animated by a ideology of progress in the way we just described, in the sense that they were highly skilled, and what they wanted is to make things work. I don't want to be demeaning in any way, but there was an element of it was just making sure the things worked in itself. I mean, there's an obvious twist in the 20th century. So lots of what we think, or what we used to think about the Industrial Revolution, comes out of the Cold War, really. When someone like Rostow, which is one of the sort of founding father of modernization theory, writes his book about stages of growth, the subtitle of the book is a non-communist manifesto. It's a way of making sure there is a justification of the American way of life in the light of obviously the communist, especially the aspirations of post-colonial development, the traction of the communist model there. That there's a clear path from the world of pre-modern to the Industrial Revolution to the American way of life. And this line that implies clearly unlimited progress and how to achieve it with some specific factors that need to be ticked is certainly the way in which we came to think about the Industrial Revolution. And it's really what we've inherited for a long time.
That American version of the Industrial Revolution, that Cold War version, that clearly feeds into where I started, to go back to where I started, which is I think most people would understand when the phrase the digital revolution is used and the ideas that are associated with it. That package of ideas isn't a million miles away from an ideology. And it is an ideology often of progress. It is an ideology of a particular view of the economic drivers of innovation and the kind of society in which that innovation should take place, which is one of the reasons why the very recent, we're talking a couple of weeks ago, discovery that the Chinese could take OpenAI technology and much, much more cheaply produce just as effective a version of what ChatGPT thought it had a monopoly of. ChatGPT was presented as the story of American innovation, American progress. And it turns out that the micro innovations, the people who are doing it cheaper, the people who are using this technology and just thinking, how can we make it more effective at a lower level? They're not conceptualizing it, they're just tweaking it. That's happening in China. I mean, China is not a communist society, it's a capitalist society, but it's China, it's not the United States of America. I think when we think about the digital revolution, we can see the ideological and political structures behind a term like that. And yet, the Industrial Revolution, we should be able to think of it in those ways too. It's become more like a totemic phrase for something that isn't ideological, that is just a thing that happened and changed the way that human beings were able to live. What I'm trying to get at is it must have been very similar to the thing that we're living through now in the way it was experienced. It must have been. One of the standard criticisms of the world that the Industrial Revolution created, so the world of the last 250 years, is that it did commodify human experience. It sort of turned things that previously had some kind of organic or natural form into the mechanical, sellable, pigeonholable, mechanizable versions of themselves, including thinking and knowledge. I mean, including the ways that human beings think about the world. It turned human beings into, I mean, this is the cliche, cogs in the machine, right? That's part of the critique. And a lot of the political philosophies of liberation of the last 250 years have been attempts to liberate human beings from a world created by the Industrial Revolution in which they themselves have been mechanized. The counter story is no, the Industrial Revolution is the liberation event in human history. It didn't just liberate us from death. It liberated us in so many ways. We are so much healthier, better educated. We have so much more access to new ideas than we would have done. It was a shrunken world, and this world was opened up by this revolution. That's in response to the view, which is it was a natural world, a human world, and it was mechanized by this revolution, and so that actually our intellectual horizons ultimately have shrunk. Do you have a side in that fight?
You've summarized it really well. I mean, anyone who tells you that it was better before, I would want them to go and have a little peek at, yeah, I think they're just completely fooling themselves. But people who have no critical engagement with the way in which the changes happen is equally deluded. I mean, the environmental risk, the changes into human experience can be extraordinarily damaging or deteriorate our quality of life. So there's no doubt. I mean, the world of accidents, pollution, and industrial risk existed, was part of the consciousness of industrialization from very early on. It's not something we've just discovered in the later stages. So I think both are there. I mean, that's unquestionable. But more importantly, it's not so much that it's a plus or a minus. It's just a change in the nature of experience. Think about this. When you're in a railway carriage, I'm sure you've done this as a kid, or maybe I still do it as an adult. But when you see sort of, the line, the electric lines shifting and the kind of kinetic vision, it's another way of seeing and feeling place. Well, there's a very good argument that Impressionism is the artistic child of the world of steam, of those, Monet's railways, locomotives arriving, steamy station, the changes in the perception. So changes like this will create things that we regard as high culture and would very value. So I think what it does, it changes the framework in which humans live and perceive and therefore the way they conceptualize it. It's our task as humans in every generation to make it as just and good as possible. But I don't think it is just a simple value judgment. And I think people who have been seeing this as especially the later stages of this industrial revolution, when the mass culture, the fact that, the steam press can print hundreds of thousands of sheet of paper, and this as, the world of the tabloids, basically, and a degradation of what used to be a higher culture, is again wrong in the same way, because precisely for the reason we said, that kind of popular enlightenment version is also fundamental, but also because what is accessible is incredible. Kid on YouTube can learn so much nowadays without even attending a course. So I think the two together, but what is more important is the way in which it changes the structures of perception or the structures of experience.
Coming up next on the history of revolutionary ideas, we go back to revolutions in the more familiar, the more traditional sense, by talking about the American Revolution. I'm going to be speaking once again to the historian Eric Nelson, who was our guide to humanism, about a very different sort of revolution. 2 episodes on the American Revolution, one on the Declaration of Independence coming next, and after that, a second episode on the American Constitution, the founding document of the American Republic. And there will also be a bonus episode thinking about the American Revolution and Donald Trump. Do join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.